Randy Stapilus is doing a tour of all of his favorite spots all over Idaho. In fact, he was just telling me off air about one of his favorite restaurants, giving me a recommendation. So the next time I head for Pocatello, I know exactly where I'm going to be having my lunch. It's 8:44. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're headed for a quick warm-up today. It's already 46. We're looking for temperatures at least in the low to mid 50s before we wrap up the day. And we'd like to welcome Randy back to the program. Good morning.
Good morning.
Right off the top, there's a story that I happened to see it, I think Friday or Saturday, which is we've had these come up before in the state of Idaho. There is a bill proposed that would allow the use of Bibles in school for reference material, not necessarily for worship, but for reference material. Does this thing stand a chance of passing?
Well, I think it may very well pass, and the argument against it really isn't that it's likely to be stricken down in court or something along those lines. There really isn't any opposition along those kind of lines. The point is that people have argued against it with is that Bibles are in a lot of schools for reference type purposes, and there's no challenge to that. That's considered to be already under existing court rulings. That's already considered to be a valid thing to do. That there's really no argument that you can't do that. Cheryl Nuxall, who is sponsoring the legislation, was making the argument that, well, a lot of teachers are concerned that they may get into trouble if there's use of a Bible for reference purposes. But as long as you're not using it to have the school or its officials, which is another way of saying the government, conducting a religious service, as long as you're not doing that, then you're probably on pretty good ground. And the only thing that would shake that up is if there were a ruling that it were somehow unconstitutional, which seems really likely. But if you did get a ruling like that, a state law wouldn't stand in the way of it very effectively. So it's a little bit hard to see what effect that it would have. Nothing terrible there that anybody's worried about in terms of major negative effects of any kind. But there's, I guess, just a lot of question of whether it would actually accomplish anything.
And I was when you brought this up that already you have Bibles in some of these schools. I assume if you go to the school library, you can find religious texts from multiple different faiths that are just there for the reference of students who might have a book report or that they have to put together a paper.
Right, and the Bible generally among them. That's it's kind of a standard reference work. Even people who aren't religiously active often have a Bible in their home or in some other place as a reference. And that's there's no major difference with that with schools. If you go to a public library, you'll generally see them, and that's there's really no debate or issue about that.
And I can remember in high school when we were studying John Milton, or if you were studying history and Lincoln's House Divided speech, those are all filled with biblical references already. It may not be the Bible itself, but the history is peppered with it.
Well, there's the history, there's the literature. You make the point about biblical references appearing all over the place and in lots of poetry and lots of other places. That's obviously true. It would be really pretty foolish just on those kind of levels to try to imagine that didn't exist.
Randy Stapilus, our guest this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310. KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley, 8:48 and 45. Randy, very quickly, too, for people who'd like to take a look at Idaho Weekly Briefing, where do you send them?
I would send them to www.ridenbaugh.com. That's RIDENBAUGH.
There was a Supreme Court decision in Washington last week that has some impact on Idaho. Obviously, that Supreme Court story has been overshadowed by the events of the weekend, but still very important. Because it's not necessarily a done deal, but the EPA has had a setback in its efforts to try to regulate water and other various plant emissions and carbon and the like across the country. And there's some applauding of that going on in the Republican delegation here in the state.
Well, there may need to be a real careful look at exactly what the status of that decision was and how final it was. There's going to be a lot of real close legal examination that's going to be going underway because of after the death of Justice Antonin Scalia this last weekend. Anything that he did that was formally released while he was still alive is of course valid as anything else that he would have done. But the catch is that if it wasn't formalized before his death, then, as what I've read from a number of legal scholars, is that whatever actions, ideas, opinions within the court he may have had, those are now void. And it's an 8-member court that may, on a lot of more heated issues, be split 4-4, that may wind up governing on a lot of these things. It's going to be a very interesting little period. There were a number of big issues that were hanging that way, a number of which may have gone on 5-4 decisions, and now may wind up essentially dying on a tie with no Supreme Court decision at all over the next number of months. And this I'm not sure how conclusive the status was, but this is one of those topics that could fall under that category.
That a friend of mine told me that over the weekend. I trust his judgment because he's got a law background and he's got a PhD, and he said that in these 4-4 ties, then the lower court rulings stand, and so you just move on from there.
Well, the interesting thing about the lower court ruling standing, and that's my understanding as well, is that you could wind up with we have something like 14 or 15 circuit courts of appeal around the country, split up geographically, and decisions bubble up from those courts of appeal to the Supreme Court. Well, what happens if the Supreme Court simply declines or is unable, maybe in a case like this, to make its own determination? What happens is that lower court ruling stands, but it only stands in that circuit. So you could have an interpretation of the law that in one circuit, say in southern states or in northeastern states or in western ones like us, that applies in that area that doesn't apply to the rest of the country.
So the EPA then would have regulatory power in some regions, but not in others.
Oddly enough, that's a possibility.
Well, we are definitely in some uncharted territory right now.
We certainly are. There are a lot of people who are doing a lot of legal research and trying to figure out exactly what the implications of this are going to be.
Because we could be a good year before we actually have a ninth justice.
Entirely possible. That's entirely possible.
Now, I had a congressional candidate tell me some years ago that you can have just one justice on the Supreme Court. You could have 8 of them retire or pass away, and you could have one person left, and that person would then be considered the majority and could rule because there wouldn't be any ties. So you only need one justice, but you have to have somebody there to decide to give that advantage, whether it be 1 or 2 or 3. Somebody has to be able to come up with a decision, and that was also new to me too as well when I heard that.
Essentially, yeah, that would certainly be right, because there isn't a firm limitation on exactly how many Supreme Court. Oddly enough, there isn't a requirement that the Supreme Court consist of a specific number of justices. And so, in theory, if you have 9 justices, and let's say that 2 of them were incapacitated in a car accident, for example, you'd still have an odd number of justices remaining. And that odd number of justices could presumably always come to some kind of a decision. And if you had just 1, that would be the case. But when you have an even group that is an even-numbered group that's evenly split, the way it is right now, or the way it's likely to be on a number of significant issues, then you've got something else again. And that's And we really are moving into, because we haven't been in a situation, at least in more than 100 years, where we've had an even number of justices and a very long stretch of time, like a year or more, without filling that judicial seat. We could be in some definitely new territory.
I think you need to be in a classroom explaining this. Uh,
There'll be a good civics lesson coming out of
yes.
it, I'm sure.
We've got 8:54. Randy Stapilus, our guest from Idaho Weekly Briefing this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. You've been doing some driving, lots of driving, in fact, in the region because of the trip you're on. Gasoline prices, the best they've been in quite some time. And we were talking off air, will this actually inflate that transportation fund? Because if people, when prices drop, they often drive more, but that means we'll see more tax revenue coming from each gallon sold.
All of that's possible. The gas prices are certainly down. Filling up in traveling around the region over the last couple of days, I've been very happy to see with what I've wound up paying at the pump compared to what I usually do. But yeah, it could have that effect as we move more into springtime weather. If the prices hold at lower levels for a while, we could see some additional driving, because driving tends to go up in the spring and summer. The catch is, of course, there's no way of knowing how long the lower prices are going to last. Probably if history is any guide, they're not going to last all that long.
Right. But I think about if I'm making a drive to Boise and it's $3.50 a gallon, I take some time and think the drive over. But if it's $1.50 a gallon, I'm more likely to say why not and make that drive and maybe make it more frequently. And so
Absolutely,
that
absolutely,
that
and I can
tax keeps
imagine a lot of people doing that.
and that tax keeps accruing then, and so that fund we might start to do a better job of replenishing it than we actually thought we would.
Well, at least to some degree, because the tax remains the same. The tax doesn't diminish with the overall gas price. The amount of tax per gallon is the same. So if people are buying more gallons, then they're paying more in tax revenue. So that would be right.
Got about 8:56 coming up on the end of this segment of the program. I do want to mention Randy is going to be in studio with us tomorrow, along with Steve Millington, and we're going to focus a bit on the column Randy wrote over the weekend about. It's odd, we mentioned a few weeks ago. You were pointing out that we don't have a lot of dissension in the Republican Party when it comes to state legislative races this year, but on the other hand, when it comes to the presidential contest, we've got quite a quite a difference of opinion among Republicans, and we'll delve into that a little bit more tomorrow.
That should be a very interesting conversation. There's the discussion nationally has become pretty heavy duty.
And it does seem that I was surprised that a lot of the old Paulites, I guess you call them, with Rand Paul out, I'm shocked that some of them that I know are behind Trump, because Paul does not like Trump, but yet a lot of his old supporters seem to think that this is the guy. So it's shaping up to be a very unusual process.
Well, and that whole question of who goes where as various candidates drop out is kind of a key question too, because eventually you will wind up with presumably two last people standing, two last men standing in this case, and who knows who that will be, but a lot depends on where the support from the fallout candidates goes.
One will be very wealthy and the other will speak Spanish. That's my prediction. Randy Staples, I want to thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.
We'll talk to you then.
Take care. Randy is the publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing. He joins us on Monday mornings between 8:40 and 9 o'clock. We're coming up on 9 o'clock news in just a moment, and we have, speaking of a candidate, as we said earlier, it's a rare election year in Idaho, when you don't have a lot of infighting going on in the Republican Party over state legislative seats. This is one of those years. There's not much of that going on. However, there are still candidates out there who are willing to challenge. One of those will be joining us in just a few minutes following the news at 9 o'clock. And she's going to tell us why she has decided to challenge a sitting Republican in her legislative district. That's on the way.